Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, from across the JCU community and beyond. I would like to welcome you to the 6th edition of JCU's Conversations with Alumni series and the second in 2021. My name is Jack Growden and I'm a proud alumnus of James Cook University and a former staff member of the Alumni Relations team. While I've now moved on to a new role as founder and CEO of Lighthouse International, a non-government organisation bridging the digital divide across Australia and Papua New Guinea, I am thrilled to continue hosting these panel sessions once every 2 months, featuring some of JCU's extraordinary alumni in discussions about the most pressing matters of our time. JCU is a place that is very close to my heart, and I love being able to continue meeting some of its more remarkable products, motivating change around the world. So I look forward to moderating this insightful webinar. However, before we continue, I wish to acknowledge the Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first inhabitants of this country and pay my respects to the traditional owners and elders, past and present, of the land on which JCU conducts its business. In the spirit of reconciliation, I also acknowledge the valuable contribution that Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples continue to make to James Cook University and the broader community. Well, to all of our alumni in the audience, thank you for joining us. As always, our list of registrants highlights the global span of our alumni community. Throughout this series, we've been joined by alumni in more than 60 countries from all corners of the world. And again, we certainly have a multinational audience befitting tonight's critical insight into one of the most important parts of the globe, that's being Asia. Australia's history, beginning with our First Nations peoples, is intensely multicultural, and our geographical position lays firmly within Asia, with interwoven links and relations to Southeast Asia through trade, diplomacy, and the millions of our citizens either born or claiming heritage from Asia. Even a quick glance towards our JCU alumni cohort illustrates this, as our university has graduated more than 5,000 graduates of Asian descent. Outside of Australia, the highest countries of origin for our alumni are China, India, and Indonesia. More broadly, these nations are amongst our largest trading partners, our closest neighbours, and our trusted security allies. Prime ministers from each side of the political spectrum have perceived Australia's future as Asian, and yet it's fair to say that Asia literacy is sorely lacking amongst Australians. So, to bring light to the strong economic, diplomatic, and cultural links between Australia and Asia, I'm thrilled to be joined by a very astute and experienced all-alumni panel, which we are honoured to have comprising 3 distinguished graduates of JCU. As I remarked throughout the series last year, as an alumnus of JCU myself, I'm proud to be counted among the same group as our esteemed panellists who join us this evening, and all of you in the audience doing wonderful things around the world. So let me begin by introducing our panel. Firstly, I'm delighted to introduce Eleanor Mack, who graduated from James Cook University in 1995 with a Bachelor of Arts and Bachelor of Laws, and has since forged a distinguished business career across the Asia-Pacific region. Eleanor is the co-founding managing director of VentureNauts, which helps ventures accelerate by growing market competitiveness, and CEO of Guru Advantage, which provides global virtual internships that prepare interns with confident work readiness skills. She has consulted for the Asian Development Bank as an international regulatory expert in various countries. Eleanor is a strong advocate of Australia-ASEAN economic diplomacy and serves as the Australian-ASEAN Business Council President, Australian Executive Chair of the China-initiated RCEP Industry Cooperation Committee, and Adjunct Professor at the National University of Malaysia. We are thrilled to have Eleanor joining us from Brisbane to contribute her valuable input into the discussion. So welcome, Eleanor. Oh, have we got Eleanor there? Yeah.
Thank you.
Our pleasure. And next, we are pleased to welcome Brent Anderson, who is currently Tourism Australia's Regional General Manager for South and Southeast Asia. Having graduated from James Cook University in 1994, he is responsible for the marketing of Australia in a diverse set of source markets throughout the region, focused upon deriving economic benefits for Australia from inbound tourism. Brent has over 20 years' experience promoting Australia to international visitors, with a key focus upon developing partnerships with tourism and non-tourism global organisations. Having lived and travelled for almost 15 years in the Southeast Asian region, he is a passionate ambassador for the potential of the region to deliver growth for Australia's tourism industry. So welcome, Brent. Thank you for taking the time to join us from Singapore, where I believe there's quite a thunderstorm happening at the moment.
It's coming and going, Jack, but thank you very much. Great to be here. Thank you.
Excellent. And finally, we are pleased to welcome back someone we can describe as a regular to our Conversations with Alumni series in our Chancellor, Mr. Bill Twaddell. Bill graduated from James Cook University with a Bachelor of Arts in 1972 and a Bachelor of Economics in 1976, before enjoying a long career in Australia's diplomatic service, holding roles such as the Ambassador to the Philippines, the Ambassador to Vietnam, and various other senior positions, including in India and Hong Kong. Bill was one of our inaugural Outstanding Alumni in 2010 and is the first alumnus to serve as Chancellor of our university. Welcome, Bill. We were thrilled to have you on board in the Conversations Alumni series last year. So thank you so much for joining us again. And I believe you have a few words of welcome for your fellow panelists.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jack, for that very kind introduction. I'm really very proud to be the first alumnus to serve as Chancellor of James Cook University, and particularly when I see the quality of other people who have come through our university, and to count myself among the 90,000 or so alumni of our university. So a couple of things. I mean, it's a great pleasure, again, to be part of this series. Tonight's topic, I think, is of great interest. It's certainly of great interest to me, both in my capacity as Chancellor, but also as someone who enjoyed a 40-year career in diplomacy. In fact, that career was focused on Asia by very definite choice on my part. 6 of my 8 overseas postings, long-term postings, were in Asia, very much by design. And in fact, the only 2 postings I had outside Asia, one in Athens and one in London, were not ones I in fact had sought. I was asked to go there, though I do console myself with the fact that one of those was the home of democracy and the other one was the home of parliamentary democracy. And I have my younger son, Paul, to show for our time in Athens. I'm really looking forward to hearing from our other distinguished panelists, Eleanor and Brent, and very pleased to sit on this panel. I was saying before we came on air that no doubt Eleanor and I could swap some tales, mostly positive, but some probably horrid, about living as we both did and working in Manila. But that's not our purpose tonight. I do recall, however, that at a farewell function for one of the 3 South Korean ambassadors with whom I overlapped in the Philippines, I remember him saying how much he had enjoyed his 4 years based in Manila, his 3 years in the Philippines, and his 1 year spent on the EDSA Avenue, which is one of the most congested thoroughfares, if you could call it a thoroughfare, in Manila. But what a wonderful country nonetheless, as I'm sure Eleanor would agree. I think the theme of our session, Understanding Our Region, Australia, Asia and the Tropics, is an important one, especially for a university so far-sightedly conceived by our founders as being Australia's university for the tropics. First, if I may, a couple of salient facts. South and Southeast Asia represent some of the fastest growing economies on Earth. Our most recent estimates suggest tropical South and Southeast Asia represent around 10% of global economic output and some 60% of tropical output. Between the early 1990s and 2019, more than 300 million people escaped extreme poverty in tropical South and Southeast Asia. If you include the whole of China, because it does intersect, that would be a figure of something like 1 billion people. Life expectancies, maternal and health outcomes and literacy rates have improved in the region and are more comparable now to global averages, and more countries, most recently Sri Lanka and Timor-Leste, have essentially eradicated malaria. South and Southeast Asia remain important producers of primary resources such as seafood, meat, cereals, but also increasingly high-tech products such as semiconductors. Tropical Southeast Asia alone is responsible for 40% of global ICT exports. So that's a bit about our region. So what I'm saying really here is that the substance of our session tonight is of global relevance, not just regional. Now, the lofty ambition set for tonight's conversation is that it will illustrate to the audience how deep the connection is between Australia and the nations which surround us. I hope it will, and I'm very confident that it will be, because of the caliber of the people I'm able to share tonight's panel with. So thank you, Jack.
Terrific, Bill. And look, echoing Bill's sentiments, thank you so much to all the panelists for joining us. We certainly have a very high caliber panel to take us through this session, exploring those interrelationships between Australia and Asia. So just before we continue, to our audience, should you have any questions that you'd like one of our three panelists to address, please pop them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll endeavour to get them answered probably towards the end of the webinar. So look, without any further ado, let's move on to Eleanor. Throughout this session, we're aiming to illustrate the deep links between Australia and Asia, and perhaps the oldest relationship builder for societies has always been trade. As the head of the Australia-ASEAN Business Council, can you set the scene for us, Eleanor, and just cast light on the volume and nature of trade both to and from Southeast Asia and the continent more broadly?
Many thanks, Jack. It's such a privilege to be invited to be part of the JCU Alumni Conversation Series, and with the distinguished panelists like Bill and Brent. So as a proud JCU alumnus of one of more than the 5,000 graduates of Asian descent that you mentioned, I am very passionate about advocating for stronger connections between ASEAN and Australia. Just to be clear though, ASEAN is comprised of the 10 Southeast Asian countries: Brunei, which is the chair of ASEAN this year, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. And it's got a population of over 655 million, a growing middle class with increasingly sophisticated consumption needs, and it's undergoing rapid urbanization and industrialization. With a young population, it has the third largest labor force in the world. In 2020, ASEAN had an estimated GDP of over $3 trillion, which is a huge increase from previous years, and it's the world's 5th largest economy. So while there is greater understanding about the region and Australia-ASEAN trade has improved considerably, I guess I'm perhaps going to be a little bit controversial in saying that ASEAN remains an opportunity that is significantly untapped by Australian businesses. It's our 2nd largest trading partner, but there is room to improve the depth and breadth of our engagement. For example, there are only just 13,000 Australian companies that export to ASEAN, and yet there are over 2.4 million actively trading businesses in Australia. ASEAN, like most countries, have been impacted greatly by COVID-19. And what the IMF expects is that Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam collectively will grow by 4.9% in 2021, which is down from its previous projection of 5.2%. In terms of the context of Australian businesses operating in ASEAN, Auschem ASEAN did a survey in 2020, found that 85% of firms in ASEAN anticipate that the COVID-19 pandemic will have a negative impact on their business. And the biggest impacts have been through the loss of customers and revenue, reduced productivity from working from home arrangements, logistics and supply chains disruptions. Vietnam, however, of the 10 ASEAN countries, is regarded as COVID-19 success story in ASEAN. And according to DFAT, will be an ideal economic partner for Australia. But it only accounts currently for about 1.7% of Australia's two-way trade, which shows that there is much growth opportunity there. Bill would know this very well, but as the Australian government has worked really hard to put in place a range of free trade agreements, which aims to improve trade opportunities and provide a competitive edge for Australian businesses across different sectors and in different countries. The challenge is the confusion that businesses face in navigating these agreements for maximum benefit. So more needs to be done to educate and support Australian companies in accessing the benefits of the FTAs, which will in turn hopefully encourage that stronger engagement between Australia and ASEAN.
Terrific, Eleanor. And look, I think you brought up some great points there. Very interested to hear a bit later on in the session about that sort of opportunity to grow trade in the region. And on that note, some of the challenges that Australian businesses might face with engaging with that part of the world. And I think Bill will touch on the free trade agreements a little bit later on. So yeah, Bill, I will cross to you now. Naturally, underpinning substantial international trade flows, there tends to be strong and nuanced diplomacy between countries. You mentioned having held both head of mission and other senior roles across Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia, and Hong Kong. Could you perhaps give us a whirlwind lay of the land of Australia's diplomatic relations with Asia as they stand now?
No pressure. There is really a lot to be said here, and I think there are things that we'll pick up on later that Eleanor's said there. I think there's a lot there to unpick. Look, to begin with, Australia, and in particular Northern Australia, through our First Nations people, has been trading and working with Asia for centuries. The historian Henry Reynolds, formerly of JCU, as you all know, estimates that in the early 20th century, as much as 40% of the population of the Cairns to Cardwell district in far north Queensland were non-Europeans. Similarly, Mackay, Broome, Darwin were thriving multicultural communities. This included First Nations Australians, South Sea Islanders, Southeast Asians, and South Asians. People of Chinese descent were in fact among the largest non-European group in far north Queensland. However, the introduction of the White Australia policy in 1906 meant that Kanakas, the indentured labourers brought to Australia chiefly to work in the sugar industry and cotton, were repatriated back to the Pacific Islands. Severe restrictions were placed on the entry of Asians into Australia, and Indigenous Australian groups were increasingly isolated as a result of other policies on government settlements and church missions. Now, this is to give some historical perspective. I think I'm right in saying that the first export from Australia was indeed to Asia. It was coal from Newcastle back in 1801, I think, was exported to Calcutta, about 150 tons. So the idea of trading with the Asia, and I think we've got to keep in mind too that when we're talking about Australia and its region, we're also talking about the Indo-Pacific. It's not just Asia, but that's a whole different discussion. Since the White Australia policy was renounced, abandoned, or whatever the right term was in the 1970s, we've become, I think it's clear that we are a very strong, vibrant, multicultural nation with strong trading and diplomatic relations throughout the region. That is something to which governments of various hues in Australia, while there may be questions of emphasis, has been very committed. More recently, from the various roles I've undertaken in my career, having served, as you've said, as ambassador or head of mission on 4 occasions, all of them in Asia, Sri Lanka, Hong Kong, Vietnam, and the Philippines, the growing internationalization of business and trade has been a tremendous amount of the focus of our diplomatic work, of our representatives, and Brent could back that up, and I think Eleanor. Trade policy, for much of my career, had been the responsibility of a separate government department. In my opinion, the integration of those two functions in the late 80s was probably the most important and most significant machinery of government change of my time, because what became known as the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, it was so much better. It put paid to a lot of these sterile arguments about competition between our trade objectives and our foreign policy objectives, which was a really barren old discussion, really, in a situation where Australia is just so obviously and quintessentially a trading country. And those debates, I think, blunted the effectiveness of our activities projecting Australia across the board for trade and aid and so forth. So I could unpick that if people wanted me to, but I think also we need to remember, and I think Eleanor's already given us a good sort of survey of this. I think that our engagement with the region is not just confined to our bilateral relationships. I think that relationship with ASEAN and the long-standing relationships with ASEAN are very important. Our multilateral efforts through ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, is very central to our regional diplomacy, to our international diplomacy. And we've recognized this for a very long time. In fact, in 1974, before I'd even taken up my career in foreign affairs, Australia became the first external country, that's to say the first non-ASEAN member country, to develop a formal relationship with ASEAN. The point I'm trying to make here is that there's been a fairly long-standing official recognition of the importance of our region to Australia's interests. We're becoming more and more focused towards Asia, as many know. The region is growing rapidly. We've heard eloquently on that. It means that Australia has the opportunity to be part of this regional growth by partnering up, as Eleanor said, with ASEAN to work on solutions to issues that can be mutually beneficial. I think our reasons for doing so, if you want to go there, cover the whole gamut of economic reasons, geopolitical reasons, moral reasons, quite importantly. We are a country that stands for something. That's why people want to migrate to our country. We have something, we stand for something which is valuable and indivisible. And I think that's all of those elements speak to the need for good, close relations with our region. It's also crucial that Australia walk the walk as well as talking the talk. The latter is the easy bit. Talking the talk is the easy bit. Regional is as regional does. And I think that the story there overall has been a positive one. I mean, one of the things that I think really is clearest in looking back over a 40-year career is that navigating through dramas and challenges is made all the better if you've got good communication going both ways. You each understand each other. That seems so blooming obvious, but it can be lost sight of in the development of policy and the implementation of policy. That involves listening as well as speaking because you need to be heard, but listening to the other person's point of view and to find common solutions. I'd like to return to that at some point, but genuinely listening and being responsive to others' needs and perspectives are very strong points, if I may say so, more and more of Australia's approach to its conduct of our international relationships. And I think we'll have scope to return to that later on in the discussion, Jack, if it goes in the directions that we've predicted.
Sure. No, terrific, Bill. Thank you very much. Brent, I will move to you now. So tourism is one of Australia's largest exports, well, at least, in the pre-COVID years, of course. Yet beyond that, when we talk about relationship building within regions, tourism is one of those more intimate exports, if you will. And what I mean by that is, when foreign consumers, say, smelt iron ore, it doesn't leave them developing such an affinity with our country as if they have visited in the past. Could you perhaps follow suit and set the scene for us in regards to the pre-COVID volume and nature of trade between ASEAN and Australia and the ASEAN region?
Yeah, thanks for that. I think I can talk very confidently about the inbound numbers because that's what I'm focused on. So about 1.5 million of Australia's 9 million international visitors in 2019. COVID, we're just writing off that year, came from Southeast Asia, and that represents about 16% of our international arrivals for all purposes visit, holiday, VFR, which we bunk together as leisure visitors, but also importantly, education as well. And you see that reflected in the spend figures, which is the key reason Tourism Australia exists, that represents 24% of our export earnings from arrivals. So they're a huge growing middle class. Eleanor touched on those figures. Consider Indonesia will be one of the top 3 middle classes in the world by 2030. That's a phenomenal growth rate. And it's an opportunity right next door to us with the recent SEPA agreement as one of those free trade agreements for Australian industry to start getting their heads around. It's more importantly, and Bill's touched on this a little bit, of starting that dialogue and understanding. We all come from different cultures, and that difference is actually what makes us interesting as a planet and makes, Australians' lifestyle is one of its key attractors in my industry for tourism, etc. And experiencing that insider's guide. If I look at the other aspect of it where tourism is really important, is one of the things we're tracking at the moment is the aviation access with reduced travellers. So governments from both sides are actually supporting a lot of those flights because those flights also underneath the passengers have cargo capacity, and 84% of Australia's exports are actually carried by air cargo, and the biggest cargo port for Australia's goods is actually Singapore. So it's a critical aspect across so many different industries. That drives it. Australia outbound travel to, Bali gets over 1 million visitors, just one island in Indonesia a year from Australia. So just that exploration of the Southeast Asia region. And what that does is it exposes you to that culture and also celebrates those differences. It also breaks down some of those stereotypes that we have. And I think that's one of the key importance or values that I see from tourism is people get together, they share beautiful experiences, they like showing up and hosting guests, etc., both ways. And that then it supports those diplomatic efforts and the people to people. And quite often you will see, even if they're maybe recent incidences around disputes at a political level, the people underneath go, oh no, I don't see all Australians like that. We know that's just your politicians sticking up for their point of view kind of thing. And that's very encouraging, because that eases the way from a business sense, but also just stops those frictions from escalating beyond and being stuck in those stereotypes. Yeah,
that's terrific, Brent. Look, I as someone that's travelled a lot in my young life as well, I think it's the most valuable endeavour that anyone can do. And I certainly agree with what you've just said there. Eleanor, back to you now. All three panellists, have highlighted that substantial activity between Asia and Australia, particularly Brent just then. Yet, despite sharing that geographic neighbourhood that we speak of, our country is culturally and sociopolitically quite different to many of the trading partners in the region. It's such a diverse part of the world, with Muslim majority democracies like Indonesia, Christian majority Philippines, absolute monarchies, autocracies, and certainly significant socioeconomic gulfs between countries. So in your role at the Australian ASEAN Business Council, have you found that Australians find navigating this diverse neighbourhood a challenge when doing business? And how can we overcome those challenges, if they are there, to really tap into those opportunities that you were mentioning before?
Thanks very much, Jack. Australians, and I guess in particular Brand Australia, has a really good reputation in ASEAN for providing high quality service and products. And in a short answer, yes, the diversity in ASEAN definitely poses a challenge to businesses from countries like Australia, where we are used to conducting business transactionally, and the environment in which we work in is underpinned by a very strong rules-based foundation. Mm-hmm. But I guess what we need to be trying to do is to encourage Australian companies to change their mindset and also see that within this diversity, there is opportunities to be mined. I've worked in Cambodia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Laos, and Philippines, and I've helped governments pilot or improve their regulation-making systems. I've helped companies move to Australia, and Australian companies move to ASEAN. And without a doubt, the consistent feedback that I hear is that corruption, the lack of governance, weak institutional capability, lack of skilled labor force are some of the top challenges that businesses face. And on top of that, there is the different business and cultural practices across the 10 countries, which poses an additional challenge. Yes, ensuring that your product or service is fit for purpose and meets a need in ASEAN is important, but finding a trusted local partner and resources, a team, and connecting to strong networks and getting reliable professional advice is also critical to success in ASEAN. I'm always reminded, and Brent and Bill will know this as well from their ASEAN friends or Asian friends, that their approach is first we are friends, then we are family, and then we do business. So having a solely transactional approach to business does not work in Asia. What I'm getting to, I guess, is that, understanding the culture of the country you want to do business in has taken on an even more importance, I guess, in the pandemic, because we can't fly and meet face to face and build those personal, intimate relationships. So in a time when we need to build cultural relationships remotely across countries and across cultures, I think that we need to lean more on our Asian Australians and returning expats. So as an Asian migrant raised in Australia, I'm blessed to come from a beautiful, rich, diverse culture. I always say that. And I'm blessed to be living and working and raising a family in one of the best countries in the world. I know that my diverse backgrounds and networks and experience gives me a different perspective and approach. But similarly, our Asian Australian and Australians and returned expat communities, and even our alumnus, as Bill mentioned before our talk began, offer a wealth of experience and perspectives and networks which are shockingly underrated by Australian companies. I had a look, and there was research by job site Indeed that found that over 70% of returning expats believe Australian businesses are reluctant to hire Australians who worked overseas. And over 80% of Australian recruiters are reluctant to recommend repats, returning expats, for Australian-based roles. In terms of Asian Australians, the Diversity Council of Australia found that workers from Asian backgrounds may be well represented in entry and mid-level jobs, but are underrepresented in leadership roles. So in my mind, this is just a huge waste of talent, not just because most of our trading partners. 8 out of 10 of our top trading partners are Asian, but also because within multicultural Australia, we have an Asian diaspora with significant buying power. And so businesses, I think, would be short-sighted in not having cultural inclusivity and responsiveness as part of their business and recruitment strategies. We are so well positioned to be the bridge between East and West.
Yeah, terrific, Eleanor. I think I really want to explore that point, the sort of interrelationship between cultural practices and sensitivity and actually doing business. I think that's a really interesting one. So, Bill, I'm going to move to you on that point. I mean, the foremost role for diplomats is, to break the ice and develop cross-cultural relationships between nations. So I'm interested to hear some of the challenges that you faced doing this across Asia over a long career. And I'm also interested to hear whether you saw Australia's reputation, or as Eleanor put it, brand Australia, and standing across Asia, did it improve or change over your career, particularly as activity between the regions grew from, say, the 1980s onwards?
Yeah, I think the answer to that is it ebbed and flowed. I really have to support wholeheartedly the comments that Eleanor just made. I mean, I suppose I've spent a little over half of my 40-year career representing Australia overseas, which is an enormous privilege, but I'm paid to say good things about Australia. I was paid to do that. And I venture to suggest that Brent is too. But if you want to know, we've got a massive diaspora. We've got a massive asset at our disposal of the numbers of people of our region who've studied in Australia. And if you want to know what Australia's like, don't come to Bill Twaddell. He's getting paid to say to every Vietnamese who's stopped still long enough what a great country we are. Go to somebody who's actually studied there. They'll tell you what it's meant to be. And overwhelmingly, we should be confident about this, because overwhelmingly, the feedback will be a good piece of feedback. So I couldn't agree more. So they say about diplomats, they say a lot of things about diplomats, that what do they say? We're honest men sent to lie abroad for their country or something. Somebody once said, well, I don't think I ever lied for my country. The other thing is that I think Jack reminded me of that the best diplomats are those who are able to put their foot down without stepping on anybody's toes, but not quite sure about that either. But this is an important topic, how our perceptions ebb and flow. In her maiden speech to the House of Representatives in Canberra in September 1996, which is it was only about 6 months after I took up duty as Chief of Staff to our Foreign Minister in the new government, Alexander Downer, Pauline Hanson, who's now Senator Hanson, proposed a drastic reduction in immigration, with particular reference to migrants from Asia. The quote, which I looked up again, is that she said, "I believe we are in danger of being swamped by Asians." Her sentiments certainly echoed around the region and eroded Australia's reputation in the region to some extent. Some of that, I think, was genuine concern. Although her comments during the election campaign about Indigenous Australians, we need to remember, had led to her being disendorsed as the Liberal candidate for Oxley, too late for somebody else to be put in as her replacement. But what became the governing party knew pretty well how odious these views were. However, not everyone in our region could understand the difference between the stance of an isolated backbencher from the policies of governments of the major parties. So doubts arose, and echoes of the infamous but long discontinued White Australia policy, of course, were invoked. Now, in addition, I said before that some of that was genuine concern. I think you have to accept too that in situations like this, in addition to those who held genuine, if I think unnecessary concerns, there were inevitably others who saw this as an opportunity to put Australia on the back foot for a variety of reasons. So I think that sort of thing hasn't helped in our relationships. But despite that sort of blip, and I'm not saying that she's the only example of this, although it's a very prominent one, which our viewers will remember, we've worked very closely with our Asian neighbours to promote peace and prosperity throughout our region. Have we put our money where our mouth is? I'd say yes. As a government, I think we have. All major political parties in Australia have a commitment to strong enduring and equal relationships with our regional neighbours, whether it was, for example, the Hawke-Keating government's support for APEC and basically midwifery for APEC, and the Howard government's swift and very large response to the 1997 Asian financial crisis, which included $1 billion bailout packages for both Thailand and Indonesia. And I was privileged to be very much at the centre of that, because I was Chief of Staff to our Foreign Minister, and remember being in the room with Alexander when he had a phone call from the Treasurer, Peter Costello, about the size of that. And to be in the room when somebody's deciding that bailout should be $1 billion in the dollars of that day was a heady moment, and a very strong affirmation of being present when Australia put its money very literally where its mouth was and should be on an important issue. So my career sort of contributing to the formulation and implementation of Australian foreign policy, both at home and abroad, gave me some important first-hand insights. Now, if I could just give you a couple of anecdotes relevant, there's plenty, but in the first 15 months of my time as ambassador to the Philippines, those months were dominated by efforts to resolve the kidnapping for ransom of a gentleman called, an Australian called Warren Rodwell, by a notoriously brutal group, the Abu Sayyaf group. Thankfully, and owing to, in large measure, to a very strong bonds of mutual respect and trust developed over years, you don't do this instantly, over years, between our two governments and government agencies, that ended up having a happy ending, and Mr. Rodwell lived on and was released. Many of you will also recall Typhoon Haiyan, which struck the Philippines in November 2013 during my time there. This was the most powerful tropical typhoon or cyclone ever to make landfall, or ever having been recorded as making landfall, and the devastation was enormous. The official figures had it at some deaths at about 7,000. Many of us on the ground thought it was much more than that. The newly elected, I think they'd only been elected in September, the newly elected government responded, if I may say so, magnificently to our recommendation as an embassy, which was that the response should be go quick, go big, and back up what you do with enabling assets, military assets and personnel. And that was followed, and it was proved to be the right mix. Australians were among the first international personnel to arrive in the worst affected areas. In fact, at the embassy's recommendation, we had pre-positioned people, both down in Tacloban and within the embassy in Manila, precisely to meet this challenge. And the speed and nature of our response and our willingness to listen to what was needed, not to say a one-size-fits-all, here, we're here to help, this is what we do to help. We listened, and I mean, it was very heartening. It was scary as hell, but to see Australians and Filipinos working alongside each other, guiding in relief aircraft, for example, was marvelous, you know, air traffic controllers and people like that. So, you know, I think our response there, which I'm not saying in a self-congratulatory way, showed that even though there were others whose quantum was greater, the fact that we listened to what was needed, listened to people's views and so forth. We had people relying on our military transport to get aid in and out of other agencies because we'd done it. And this just reinforced a view, I think, that Australia was a country to be relied upon, a friend for all seasons, not just when the going's good. And that would simply not have been possible without painstakingly cultivated relationships of trust and respect. And it's also, again, it's got to be a long game. It was on the ground, the relief that we put in through C-130 aircraft and other things like that, at a field hospital at the airport in Tacloban, was much aided by the fact that the Air Force General on the ground in Cebu City, coordinating all this, was a marvellous man called Roy Devaraturda, who was a graduate of Australian study courses. In fact, at one point, the top 4 military people in the Philippines, all 4 of them had studied or trained in Australia. You know, there's got to be we have to play a long game in these respects. So that's the Philippines, and that is, I think, some examples which I hope illustrate my point. When I was in Vietnam, and I think, Eleanor, you spoke volumes there about Vietnam. I mean, if ever there was a case of opportunities for Australia to really do something in a vibrant, marvelous country, that is Vietnam. But during my time, it was possible to find and repatriate the remains of 3 of the 6 Australian service personnel who'd been left behind at the end of the Vietnam War, and also to set in train the protocols and processes which led to the repatriation of the other 3, so there's 6 of them, which happened after my term had finished. That would simply not have been possible, as earlier US efforts, for example, had shown. That would not have been possible without relationships of trust and mutual respect between former adversaries, in fact, having been forged with relevant Vietnamese contacts by me as ambassador and by my military staff and by the government as a whole. So, I also, now I've used examples which aren't commercial in nature, but I always have and always placed high priority on the commercial objectives of diplomacy as being centrally important. In fact, on my first overseas assignment in Bangladesh, I got into trouble with my High Commissioner for giving too much emphasis to trade matters. That was back in the old days of trade versus foreign policy. He was, however, later man enough to tell me he'd been wrong and I'd been right. So, at one point in my career, in the early 90s, I was appointed head of the Hong Kong, Macau and Taiwan section too, which was a very interesting and tricky circumstance. And that there's a long version of this story, so I won't tell it, but it was a really good illustration to me. There was the game between Australia and Taiwan was that they wanted greater recognition, international recognition, because a reducing number of countries recognise them as opposed to China as a legitimate government. And we wanted access to a very affluent market. We'd been talking with the Ford Corporation, who were very keen to export the Ford Capri to Taiwan. And we finally got the breakthrough we wanted, and we got access for the Ford Capri. Went back to Ford, and Ford said, "Oh, did we not tell you? We're looking elsewhere. That's no longer our objective." Now, some of my team responded to that by saying, "Oh, bloody Ford." I said, "No, you're getting the wrong message from this. The message from this is that if we'd been doing our job, we would have stayed in touch with what Ford's current plans were and tailored what we did to them." So what I'm saying to you is the business of listening and responsiveness within the government service is not just listening and responding to the foreign governments, but listening and responding to your own stakeholders as well. So that, I mean, sorry, Jack, I know you did ask for a couple of anecdotes, so I've tried to fulfill your remit. I could go on, but I'm sure a lot of people would fall asleep if I did. So no,
look, I think it's very fascinating to hear. Obviously, people remember those historic events, but to hear, anecdotes from the actual moment there, it's fascinating. So look, I will move on to Brent. Just we are moving into the last sort of third of our session. Brent, how Australia is perceived by its neighbours, as Bill was discussing then, is no doubt fundamental to the work that you've done and continue to do with Tourism Australia. So what sort of challenges have you faced in convincing people across Southeast Asia to travel to Australia? And from your experience, do you think that our close neighbours, such as Indonesia, and you mentioned, their growing middle class, do they know more about Australia than most Australians know about them?
Look, I think I'll address the parts of the question. The challenges, there's the practical challenges, different in terms of distance, cost of travel, etc. Southeast Asia is actually made for the low-cost carrier airline model as well, and the narrow-body fleet. So you're seeing the growth of Scoot, AirAsia, all of those really driving a lot of this travel becoming as part of a lifestyle, and that's a huge opportunity for Tourism Australia. Bill touched on it, that importance of Australia being there and not just fair weather friends is really, really critical. And where I'm calling from in Singapore, they still remember World War II and the Australian New Zealand forces during the occupation. So that shared history and that shared story does go a long way. And going through adversity, and Australia being always one of the first nations in this part of the world when aid is required. There's a subtlety in the culture where you don't mention it ever again because they will always remember it, but we won't go into a former Prime Minister getting coins back from Indonesia. But I think the key aspect for us is there is a default part of our brand that talks about racism, from the White Australia policy to the growth of Pauline Hanson and even some of our recent things. And it is something we as a population in Australia need to address. The other aspect that is one of the key areas we need to focus on, I am the only Australian based in a team of 27 throughout South and Southeast Asia. And I need to listen to my team about what they find appealing about Australia. It's quite humbling how these people are driving the fastest growing region for Tourism Australia. It's not their country, but they have absolute passion for our country and what it represents. And those are huge opportunities. Some have studied in Australia and formed that affinity, but others have just travelled there. That opens doors, that opens exports opportunities for us. And I think just to touch on Eleanor's point, there's a little bit of fear of the different cultures, the different types of Muslim, etc. At the end of the day, when I look at my partnerships with airlines and distribution partners and even banks, they want to make money, we want to make money. It's probably going to be a different way, and very much on Eleanor's point, Asian cultures invest so much more in relationships. So that first part of it feels very, very, very slow, because once they commit to a relationship, it is the go-to relationship. They will not drop it as quickly as a Western culture will drop it. But you have to have that patience there. But once it gets moving, it's a beautiful thing, and it opens so many other doors. Indonesia is the first country that Tourism Australia ever partnered with banks, because we never really thought what was their role in travel. And it's a model we've now taken around the world.
Terrific. Yeah, thank you, Brent. We've mentioned a lot about opportunities on this session so far. Look, as we move into the last 15 minutes of the session, let's cast our eye to the future, as we often do on this Conversations with Alumni series. Given that this has been coined the Asian century by scholars, prime ministers, and the public alike, it would be remiss of us not to allude to the increasingly strained relationship between Australia and Asia's largest economy in China. So Eleanor, I will cross to you again. With the trading terrain made more difficult here as of late, are you seeing a diversification of Australia's economic activity to other markets within Asia, such as the ASEAN region? And do you think that Australia's long-time reliance on China as a trading partner, the consumers of more than 40% of Australia's gross exports, do you think that that'll be diffused across other Asian markets over the next 10 years? Oh, sorry, Eleanor, we just need you to unmute yourself.
Sorry, thank you very much, Jack. Many of the huge weaknesses and inequalities in our systems, which have been laid bare, actually already existed before the pandemic, but they have been amplified by COVID, and we've been forced to find new ways to balance saving lives and livelihoods. We've seen unprecedented business closures and decimated employment. But there are many opportunities rising from the new normal, with demands in digital skills, blockchain, AI, e-commerce, online collaboration platforms, contactless delivery and payment, telehealth, agriculture, education, just to name a few. And there's all of these opportunities because, as we said before, ASEAN is so diverse. But what the pandemic and recent trade actions by China have also laid bare is the need for diversity in our trade markets and supply chains to minimize that over-reliance into China. For so many years, business people have said to me that trade with China was all the focus. So the interest in our closest neighbor, ASEAN, for example, wasn't accorded the level of priority or interest it ought to have. So whilst China remains a very important trading partner for Australia, ASEAN is too significant to be ignored given the opportunity it represents. And I guess, where we've talked a lot about language and communication and respect. So when rhetoric and tension collide in the media at the intergovernment level, between our governments, I guess it's incumbent on us at the business level to nurture long-standing relationships and basically do our best to keep communications open, business to business and people to people. So I guess, that's why when I was invited by the China ASEAN Business Council to be the Australian executive chair of the China-initiated RCEP Industry Cooperation Committee, I agreed, because we need to be in the tent and work collaboratively with businesses and entrepreneur leaders across the 15 RCEP member states, ASEAN, Australia, China, Japan, Korea, and New Zealand, because that then affords us the opportunity to explore new markets for our Australian businesses. Other countries are also diversifying and in some cases moving operations from China to ASEAN. But firstly, because China is no longer the cheap labor market that it used to be, but it's also strengthened by COVID-19, which has seen disruptions in supply chains. We can't put all of our eggs in one basket. It's not going to be totally easy though, because the ASEAN labor force basically lacks the experience and the diversification of China's workforce currently. And I've seen reports which says that it could be about 15 years before it catches up.
Wow, that's fascinating. Fascinating indeed. Look, Brent, I'm going to talk tourism now. Of course, the COVID-19 pandemic, which Eleanor referred to, makes for a very difficult roadblock for you to answer this. But has there been, or do you think there will be a shift in market share to ASEAN consumers amidst the political back and forth and headlines between the governments of China and Australia? And with the rapid emergence of that larger middle class in Southeast Asia, I mean, you mentioned Indonesia being one of the top 3 middle classes in the world soon. Will Australia be a destination high on their list, do you think?
We've got natural advantages just in our proximity and the closest Western destination perception. In terms of the relationship at a people-to-people versus a government-to-government, we'll only know when borders open, but I don't actually see a major deterioration in our attractiveness and appeal. And our research that we just recently done in the Consumer Demand Project shows that China, we're still a very highly considered and intended destination, and actually across the whole region. I think it's, you know, if you look at the wine import tariffs that's been imposed, if the old saying, put all your eggs in one basket, you need to be ready. And I think that's where both the Australian government and private enterprise need to work together to have these markets where you can divert attention if there is a hiccup along the way. That's just common sense. With the whole COVID situation, one of the first things that my country manager in Malaysia told me in the simplified Mandarin there, that the symbols that they use, the second symbol actually means opportunity. And I think this is an opportunity for a reset, for us to look at where we are getting all of our visitors and where we're dependent upon. And it is cyclical in nature. If you look at Japan, which is a growing market for us, it was close to 750,000 arrivals, then went down in cycle and we're back on an up cycle. So that's a normal business planning and forecasting project you need to do. And you start looking at those fundamental macroeconomic areas, but those links that we have help pave the way and allow you to capitalize on those opportunities very quickly. I think the other aspect is the relationships that have been developed are long-term, as we've talked about previously, and they will help us weather those storms and just ease some of those perceptions.
Terrific. Yeah, very well put, Brent. Look, Bill, I would like to finish the session with you. We are running out of time, so if you can keep this answer a little bit shorter. Look, amidst the increasing strategic competition between China, the United States, and the latter's allies within the region, we have seen some of the countries referred to tonight, India, Japan, and Indonesia, draw closer to Australia through dialogue such as the Quad. At the beginning of the session, you gave us a bit of a lay of the land of Australia's diplomatic relations within Asia as it stands now. If we cast an eye to the future, how do you see this terrain sort of changing over the next decade or so? Bill, your microphone, mate.
Sorry. Yeah, look, it's hard. It's hard to predict, because who would have said 10 years ago that we would be where we are right now, pandemic among other things. I've had much better China scholars than me puzzled by the stand of the recent stance of the government in China. I think I'm mentioning China because it's clearly going to be a major factor in how relationships develop in our region. That's to state the obvious, I think, and to cap what's been said before tonight. So how China defines its greatness, to use that wonderful phrase about 2 decades ago by Bill Clinton, I think in Sydney, how China defines its greatness and how it nurtures what it does in its relationships with others in the meantime will have a lot to do with the strategic environment in which we carry ourselves forward in our region. I think that the American response to that is going to be incredibly important. I do think that important opportunities were squandered in recent times. I mean, there are different theories about the warrior diplomacy, etc., of China in the recent past, what that represents. Some people who know more about China than me say that that represents a miscalculation about where China has arrived prematurely in world affairs. Well, that may be so. Others have wondered whether it reflects some changing power relationships within the Chinese government itself. Others would point to whether the vacuum in international leadership, which I would argue the unfortunate stewardship, if that's the appropriate word, by Donald Trump of the United States, whether that has emboldened people as well, I don't know. I certainly think, and I think somebody's come in with a question on Q&A, which we might get back to later, about this. I think about the South China Sea. I mean, ASEAN is an area which Eleanor is quite expert at, but I would think that the confidence, international confidence, and in their environment of most of the countries of South and Southeast Asia is underpinned, I think, very much by the continued, detailed, sustained, constructive engagement by the United States in our region. And when ambiguous signals are sent on that score, of course, uncertainty is the inevitable outcome of that.
Very interesting, Bill. Look, I think we've spoken a lot of, during this session about sort of Australia's long-standing and well-invested relationships with our neighbours, and I think they'll all hold us in great stead, as we see a ever-changing region over the next few years. So, well, look, thank you to all three of our esteemed panelists who've taken the time to give our alumni community a really interesting insight into that interrelationship between Australia and Asia. That is all we have time for. We certainly sit in a really opportune position, I think, as Southeast Asia in particular rapidly grows. And I can say for myself, it has been fascinating to learn more about our links to our diverse neighbourhood. So look, in wishing you all the best for the future, this concludes tonight's Conversations with Alumni panel session. So thank you to more than 1,000 alumni who have joined us right across the world for these sessions, and to many of you who joined us tonight as well. Thank you so much for listening, and wherever you are around the world, we wish you, our JCU alumni family, many safe and happy returns until our next Conversations with Alumni webinar in July. So good night and best wishes.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.